Good evening. All right, y'all have a first here. Up until about 15 minutes ago, we had another person doing the welcome, but that person called in sick. And then Mr. Ben Spagan and I upstairs did a rock, paper, scissors, and I assumed he was going to go with paper because he's a writer, and he went with rock. And I was like, all right, fine. So you'll have me tonight. And I got to warn you, I had 2 beers because I didn't think I was going to have a role in public speaking. So here I am to do one more welcome. This is the Global Summit 9, talk of the Global Summit 16. I messed that up, didn't I? So this is the 9th talk of Global Summit 16, and it's my pleasure to welcome all you here at the Jefferson. It's been a heck of a ride the last 3 weeks, and we've got one more week to go. So if you have not registered, please do so. Next week we have a panel led by the winner of the Thomas B. Hagen Dignitas Award last year, Major General Ed Bolton, who's going to be talking about how can we get more people from Erie to work and use the federal government to get out of poverty. So that's going to be a really, really good discussion. We have Harold Holzer the following day, who will be talking about how Abraham Lincoln would have handled the immigration problems that we have today in America. And he is, I think, the premier Lincoln historian going on right now. We have on the 12th, we have is that the 13th? 14th. Yeah, 14th, we have a panel discussion about what happened on Tuesday. We have Chris Matthews, David Urban, and Tara Stamayer. We're going to be trying to make sense of what happened a couple days ago and where is the country going. And then we're going to close the Global Summit next Friday, the 15th, with Eddie Glaude, who's going to be talking about leadership and how do we address some of the systemic problems that we have in this country. So, and that'll be the entire Global Summit. Just a reminder, if you've missed talks, they will be showing up on YouTube. I think a couple of them have upwards of 40,000 views since they happened. So literally, the Jefferson is having visitors to our YouTube page from all over the world, actually. So that's my lineup announcements. The Q&A will always work like the Jefferson, so you should have received is there a pen and paper tonight? Yes, pen and paper. If you want to ask your questions, please keep your writing legible so that Mr. Spagan can get to as many questions as he can. Also, I do want to thank one special person for making tonight's evening possible. He's probably watching from home, or he'll be watching later. Mr. Bruce Ramey, our vice chairman of the board, is both involved here at the Jefferson and with the Cato institution. So he's always shooting us scholars, and this was one of the people that he recommended. So thank you, Bruce Ramey, all the way from here to Florida. And of course, I want to thank our team. We have 6 people that are paid here at the Jefferson in full-time member. And we run a conference with thousands of people in attendance. And it included 14 programs, 22 speakers. It's not a small task. And it takes Mr. Spagan and Mr. Bartko and Christine and Chelsea and Pat and all of these wonderful, wonderful people that work here at the Jefferson and just make the organization look awesome like it is. So thank you to our staff. And last but not least, I do want to thank our sponsors. Our sponsors have made it possible for the Jefferson to have basically frozen our initial pricing for the Global Summit in 2009 at $25. We've never had a raise in our prices, and that's because our sponsors want us to make our Global Summit readily available to the citizens of Erie. And that includes students who can come for free to all of our programming. So thank you to our sponsors. And of course, one of our initial sponsors who saw what we were doing is ECRA, the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority. And folks, I think a lot of people are, what's the saying? A prophet is without honor in their home country, right? And I don't think Dr. Perry Wood is without honor. I think a lot of people know how special he is, but I don't think he gets the credit for all that he's done and for all ECRA has done for our community. Without ECRA, so many of our leading nonprofit institutions would be struggling. Without ECRA investing in our economic development, the Erie community and Erie County would not see the renaissance that it has in the last decade. And we want to thank Dr. Wood for his leadership, and we want to thank him for always believing that Erie can do things at the world-class level. So I want to welcome Perry Wood to do tonight's official introduction.
Thank you, Dr. Ferrati. Congratulations to you and all your staff at the Jefferson. This has been another amazing global summit. I've been to several of the events. It's been phenomenal. As population grows, resources become more abundant, not less. That is Dr. Marian Tupy's argument, which contradicts the conventional wisdom that finite resources lead to scarcity. Tupy and co-author Gail Pooley, after poring over 2 centuries of the prices of commodities, goods, and services, found that the relationship they call superabundance results from population and resource growth. I know that this sounds counterintuitive, but this man has the credibility to explain it to you. His many articles have been published in the nation's top magazines and newspapers, and he has appeared on the national media for years. Dr. Tupy is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity and founder and editor of humanprogress.org. He's going to discuss with us his findings tonight after they were presented in his 2023 book, Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet. Dr. Tupy received his bachelor's degree in international relations and classics from the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, and his PhD in international relations from the University of St. Andrews in the United Kingdom. Please join me in giving a rousing Global Summit welcome to Dr. Marian L. Tupy.
Thank you very much. I didn't know much about Erie until 2 days ago when I was watching the election results, and apparently you are very important. They said on TV that the way that Erie County went, so did the country, and indeed, that was true. So glad to be here. I was wondering how to start. How does my talk really how to tie it to the election result? What are we to expect over the next 4 years, but perhaps even longer? And I think that one of the ways to really tie it together is that the new president or president-elect and people around him are talking very much about economic growth, about jump-starting economic growth, increasing economic growth. And of course, if you have more economic growth, that means that you need two things. You need more people. And basically, the population of the United States is growing only due to immigration. Native-born American women have fewer babies than necessary for replacement level, and the situation is much more dire in other parts of the world. In order to keep population stable, you need 2.1 children per woman per lifetime. In South Korea right now, it's 0.7. Throughout Europe, it's about 0.5. And the second thing is that if by any chance we do increase our economic growth, that will require a lot more resources. So what is the relationship between resources and population? That is really what my talk is going to be about. So just to start with some basic statistics, 2 years ago, the population of the world reached 8 billion. And so the question is that too few or too many? 8 billion people, too few or too many? The opinions on this differ.
The great under-discussed factor in the climate crisis is there are just too many of us, and we use too much shit. Climate deniers like to say, there's no population problem, just look out the window of an airplane, something but empty space down there. But it's not about space, it's about resources. Humans are already using 1.7 times the resources the planet can support. In 1900, there were less than 2 billion people on Earth. Now it's approaching 8. We can't just keep going on like this. The world is just too crowded.
There are not enough people. I can't emphasize this enough. There are not enough people. And I think one of the biggest risks to civilization is the low birth rate and the rapidly declining birth rate. It is, and yet so many people, including smart people, think that there are too many people in the world and think that the population is growing out of control. It's completely the opposite.
There's scientific consensus that the lives of children are going to be very difficult, and it does lead, I think, young people to have a legitimate question. You know, is it okay to still have children?
Well, let's see if we can help AOC to answer that question. People have been wondering about the relationship between population growth and resources for a very long time. In 1798, an English pastor and economist by the name of Thomas Malthus claimed to have shown mathematically that resources grow at a arithmetic rate and population grows at an exponential rate. Let me explain that. Let me explain that. He believed that resources grow at a arithmetic rate, which is to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. But population, he believed, grew at an exponential rate, 1, 2, 4, 16, 32, and so on. And consequently, he believed that population must grow at a much faster pace than resources, and the gap between the two rates of growth will result in resource shortages and consequently in starvation. So keep this particular chart in mind. According to Malthus and his disciples, so-called Malthusians, it is unavoidable that when you have population growth, you will have to end up with fewer resources and ultimately starvation. Now, this issue became particularly important after the end of the Second World War, when the population of the so-called third world countries, what we would now call developing world, exploded, primarily in Asia, but later in Africa, as a result of better nutrition, as a result of better healthcare, better education, and so forth. Basically, we moved from a population of about 1 billion people in 1800 to 8 billion people today. In 1968, a Stanford University biologist by the name of Paul Ehrlich, he recently turned 93 years old and still teaches at Stanford University, he picked up the baton of overpopulation from Malthus in an extremely popular 1968 book called The Population Bomb, which was then translated into a number of languages. I think it sold like 13 million copies. As an author of a book, I would dearly love to sell even a fraction of that. Nonetheless, The book started very famously with the following words. The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. Paul Ehrlich scared and scarred generations of Americans. In 1973, his ideas were actually transformed into a movie called Soylent Green. And the premise of the movie goes something like this. There are too many people, there is not enough food. So every time a person dies, he or she is converted into biscuits called Soylent Green, which are then fed to the people left behind. This movie was released in 1973. Now look at the top left-hand corner. This is what people in America in 1973 thought New York City would look like in 2022. People being basically scooped up, transformed into cookies, and then fed to people left behind. Here is a short clip from the movie.
What is the secret of Soylent Green?
They're making our food out of people. Next thing they'll be breeding us like cattle for food. You gotta tell them. You gotta tell them.
Promise, Tiger. I promise. I'll tell the exchange.
You tell everybody. Listen to me, Hatcher. You gotta tell them. Soylent Green is people. We gotta stop them somehow.
Who recognizes the actor? Very, very good. He was not known for subtlety, was he? Well, it's 2024, and obviously we are not eating one another. I picked up this picture because it reminds me of myself in Whole Foods when I go and pick up a bottle of olive oil, and I have to choose between light, virgin, extra virgin, cold press, not cold press, Greek, Italian, Californian, a mix. So we are actually surrounded by an abundance of choices. Famines where tens of millions of people used to die around the world because food simply ran out. Famines have disappeared from the world outside of war zones. People in sub-Saharan Africa, the world's poorest continent, now get as many calories as the Portuguese did in the early 1960s. And obesity is not just a huge problem here in the United States, but it's increasingly a problem overseas. In fact, there was a study from Kenya from a few years ago showing that in urban areas, in a number of African cities, obesity is also becoming a problem. So far from starvation, we got the opposite. Now, in Superabundance, in our book, we attempt to quantify the growing abundance of commodities by looking at prices. Basically, if a price of commodity goes up, that tells us that a commodity is getting scarcer, right? You all remember, well, some of you may remember the 1970s when you had this sudden oil shock. Prices went up, oil was becoming scarcer. So when a commodity price goes up, we know it's becoming scarcer. When a commodity price goes down, we know it's becoming more abundant. And of course, prices are a reflection of decisions, hundreds, thousands of decisions made by billions of people around the world every day, okay? If you're going to work and you forget to buy a cup of coffee that you would buy on a daily basis, that price of coffee, if enough people do that, is going to start dropping. People simply forget to get their cup of coffee. There is less demand, price is going to go down. If suddenly more people on their way to work start picking up coffee, price is probably going to go up. The free market, which generates these prices, is really just a giant computer which allows you to see what you have too much of, and maybe you should produce less of, and what you have too little of, so that you should produce more of. Yeah, that's just basic supply-demand underpinning of Western capitalist society. The question is, which prices to use? You're all familiar with nominal prices. Nominal price or current price is basically what you pay in a shop. If today you all get up right now and go to a grocery store and pick up a loaf of bread, that's nominal or current price. But we all know that we cannot just rely on current prices or nominal prices when we want to figure out what's happening over a long period of time. Why? Because of inflation, right? So to move from nominal price to real price, you basically discount the real price by the rate of inflation. We've all become familiar with that concept over the last 4 years. If you want to know if something is really becoming cheaper or more expensive, you look at inflation, right? I chose this picture because this is a loaf of bread on sale in Germany in 1922 during hyperinflation, when a loaf of bread cost 1,000 billion Deutschmarks. So inflation matters, right? Now, the big problem with these two prices is what? They don't tell you how much money you are making. They don't tell you what is happening in your pocket. You all remember your parents or your grandparents who would say things like, oh, well, I was a young man, a gallon of gas cost only 10 cents or 5 cents or whatever it was. Yes, but granddad, how much were you making at the time? You know, if you were making 5 cents an hour, then, you know, it's not such a hot deal. So that's where time prices come into the picture. Time prices basically take into account the increase in wages. Time price is basically calculated by dividing the nominal price by the nominal hourly income. It's very easy to understand. If a pound of beef costs $20 and you are making $20 an hour, then a pound of beef really just costs you an hour of work. If in 20 years' time, the price of beef goes up to, I don't know, $30 an hour. Sorry, if price of beef in 20 years' time is $30 a pound, but you are making $60 an hour, then it will only cost you 30 minutes of work, okay? So all you have to remember really is that whereas nominal and real prices are denominated in dollars and cents, time prices are denominated in hours and minutes. To understand time price, you basically have to ask, how long do I have to work in order to buy something? That's the time price, okay? Now, why do we want to use time prices? Well, because time prices capture the changes in both prices and wages. So, for example, let's say that because of technological advancement, you have now moved from people bringing in the harvest with sickles and scythes to a time when you're driving a combine harvester. What happens when we live in a world where agricultural produce is produced by technology? Well, first thing that happens is that you produce much more wheat than you used to. And because you produce much more wheat, the price of wheat starts coming down. But at the same time, you, as a driver of a sophisticated machine, such as a tractor powered by GPS and AI and whatever, your income is also rising. So the time price takes into account both the productivity gain in producing more wheat, but also the productivity gain of the worker who is making more money. Okay? Second reason why we would use time prices, because time prices don't rely on official estimates of inflation. In fact, inflation doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if inflation is 10% or 10 million %. You're always dealing with price and wage at the time of the purchase in 2024, and you repeat that process in 2044, you're again dealing with price of the loaf of bread divided by your hourly income. So what happens in between doesn't matter. You're just dealing with nominal price divided by nominal income. I'll explain that in a slightly different way in a moment. Now, time prices are the same globally, which is to say an hour of work is the same in the United States as it is in China. So that allows us to compare the standards of living across countries. And it's also the same across time. So that allows us to compare the United States in, say, 2024 to United States in 1850 or whatever else. Finally, time prices are measured in time, and time is an independent variable, so it cannot be influenced by human perception. It is constant for general purposes. So outside of theory of relativity, time is constant, at least for us living on Earth. And it's also equal for everyone. Everybody has 24 hours in a day. So if instead of working 8 hours a day, like a laborer in Brazil, to earn enough money to be paid at the end of the day to buy enough food for your family, you only have to work for 30 minutes a day to earn enough money to buy food for your family. That's an improvement, right? You want to spend as little time on these basics so that you have more time to spend with your family, or maybe to go and play sports or leisure or whatever else, okay? So let me explain time prices with just one example. This data comes from Bureau of Labor Statistics and from the Federal Reserve. The nominal price of bread in 1980 was 50 cents. In other words, if you went to shop for bread in 1950, you would have to fork out 50 cents and get a loaf of bread. Because of inflation, 50 cents in 1980 is equivalent to $1.56 in 2022. That's the inflation, right? So if you are just looking at nominal prices, and many of our journalists are guilty of this, which is why you read in the newspapers, oh, something has never been this expensive, is because they are looking only at nominal prices. And indeed, if you are looking at nominal prices, then you can conclude that bread is 212% more expensive. But you are a sophisticated audience, you know that you have to adjust for inflation. That's where we move to real price. So once again, we know that in 1980 bread cost 50 cents. But we also know that bread cost $1.81 in 2022. But we know that 50 cents is equivalent to $1.81 in 2022 when you adjust for inflation. But we know that bread only cost $1.56 in 2022, which means that really bread got 14% cheaper. So once again, 50 cents in 1980 is equivalent to $1.81 in 2022. But because bread only costs $1.56, we know that bread is 14% cheaper. We'll do final adjustment, and that's the time price. Once again, we know that bread costs 50 cents, but the hourly wage of a blue-collar worker, somebody making a car in Detroit or whatever, was $6.57. And that means that our worker had to work for 4 minutes to buy a loaf of bread. By 2022, the price of bread increased to $1.56, but your hourly wage is now $26.80, which means that our worker now only has to work 3 minutes in order to buy a loaf of bread, which means that bread got 25% cheaper. So depending on whether you are working with nominal price or time price, you are either under the impression that bread is 200% more expensive, or the reality is that bread is 25% cheaper. Do you follow what I mean by time prices? Wonderful. Okay. So now, what I want to do is to look at long-term perspective. In our book, we look at food prices in the United States over a century, between 1919 and 2019. I'm going to show you only a few items. I cannot show you hundreds of different items which are in the book because you wouldn't be able to read it. It would be too small and it would take us till tomorrow. So I'm just going to show you a few. What does the red line mean, or the red chart? It shows you, the red bar shows you that the price of eggs between 1919 and 2019, over that century, the time price fell by 97%. And that means that the same amount of time which bought you 1 egg in 1919 bought you 36 eggs in 2019. the closer you get, people forget this, people get often confused. If a price of something increases by 100%, you only get half of it. But if price of something decreases by 100%, it becomes completely free. So the closer you get to 99 or minus 100%, the closer you're getting to infinity. And so a 97% decline in time price is equivalent to getting 36 times more than you did previously. Are you with me? Okay. Hence, just a fancy word for chicken, that over 1 century fell by 96% in terms of time price for our blue-collar worker. So he now gets 26 chickens for the same amount of labor that would buy him one in 1919. Remember, during the Great Depression, the political slogan was there, a chicken in every pot? Well, now you get 26 chickens, thanks to American capitalism and ingenuity. Again, we looked at hundreds of different items, but on average, we found that over that century, time prices of food fell by 91%, which means that now you get, if you thought about a basket of commodities, instead of one basket, you now get 11. Every decade, you added another basket of commodities for the same amount of time that you worked, okay? You are 11 times better off than you were in 1919. And people often don't think about it. They think that food is expensive now. No, it's just that we don't understand or don't remember how incredibly expensive food was 100 years ago, let alone 200 years ago, and so forth. Now, I was just talking about US blue-collar workers. Now let's look at the world. This is global commodity perspective between 1918 and 2018, the much maligned period of globalization, when so many different countries entered the global economy. China and India entered the global economy. 2 billion people are becoming richer, consuming more stuff. What would we expect? We would expect that stuff gets more expensive. You've got more people consuming stuff, surely stuff should get more expensive. Now, the opposite is true. Again, there are dozens, hundreds of different commodities. I've chosen just some. From the perspective of a global worker, somewhere in the middle of the pack, let's say somebody living in Mexico, the price of pork, the time price of pork, decreased by 85%. This notional worker, average global worker, now gets 6.5 pounds of pork instead of 1. Salmon decreases by 81%. Now you get 5 pounds of salmon instead of 1. Shrimp, 75%. Corn, 73%. And so on and so forth. On average, what we found is that commodities became 72%, fell 72% in time price, which means that you now get 3.5 baskets of commodities instead of 1 for the same amount of work. Abundance of resources, in other words, increased from 1 to 3.2, 3.5, which means that you are 250% better off. Now, the question that some of you may be asking is this speed of progress good enough? We have increased abundance around the world by 250% in 38 years. Is that slow? Is that fast? Well, let me put it this way. For thousands of years, you couldn't see any improvement in standards of living at all. Your standard of living would be the same as that of your parents and your grandparents, and that of your children and your grandchildren. The standard of living around the world was absolutely stationary for thousands of years. It's only in the last 200 years that we have seen this sudden increase in prosperity, and certainly in the last 40 years, we have seen more prosperity than ever before. And I would argue that we have never seen this kind of increase in global abundance in the history of the world. Now, in the book, we have looked at 18 data sets, not 18 commodities, but 18 different data sets, some of which have hundreds of different commodities in them. And what we found is that all of them are becoming more abundant, not less abundant. This is the last chart I'm going to show you. On the horizontal line, you have increase in the percentage in population. On the vertical line, you have increase in abundance. Note that there is nothing below the zero line, below the thick black line. That's because, again, as I said, nothing that we've researched has become less abundant. Everything is becoming more abundant, so consequently it has to be above zero. Now, in our work, we have divided increasing abundance into two different zones. One is increasing abundance, and the other one is superabundance. Let me explain what that means. If abundance of commodities and population were increasing at the same rate, they would all be along this line, 45-degree line. Okay? If population and abundance were increasing at the same rate, they would be all along that 45-degree line. Increasing abundance would happen if population was increasing at 2% and abundance was increasing at 1%. We could still say that abundance is increasing, but at a lower rate than population. Superabundance basically means that abundance is increasing at a faster rate than population. So if population is increasing at 2% and abundance is increasing at 3%, you are in superabundance. So what happens to these 18 data sets? This is what happened to those 18 data sets. They were all in the superabundant region. And that tells us that on average, every human being creates more value than they destroy. Let me show you this point differently. This is what Malthus said. Malthus said that resources are increasing at a lower rate than population. But in reality, it's the other way around. It's resources which are increasing at a faster rate than population. And the difference between the two rates, in the previous chart I showed you that abundance is increasing at a faster rate than population. That's what we call superabundance. And the difference between the two rates, that's new knowledge created in minds of human beings. On average, we create more than we consume. We build more than we destroy. That is essentially the point of my talk. So in our model, we start with the overall population. Only a certain fraction of human beings innovates. And so the more people we have, the more likely it is that we are going to come across an innovator. Such as, for example, this guy. This is Patrick Bell, who in 1823 came up with this primitive mode of harvesting wheat. And over the next 200 years, there was a lot of innovation that happened in the capitalist system until you end up with a modern harvester, which then decreases the prices of wheat and increases abundance of bread on your shelves. Okay? So that is essentially how prosperity happens. But is the number of people all that we need? And the argument is, of course not. If the number of people was all that you needed, then China would have been the richest country in the world, because it's always been the most populous country in the world. Certainly been the most populous country in the world for the last 2,500 years, ever since China became one country. But it was extremely poor until they started liberalizing their economy, until they embraced capitalism. So superabundance is really population times freedom. You have to have freedom so that the creative capacities of human beings are unleashed. In the previous slide, you saw all those people, right? We say we need more people so that we can have more geniuses. But if those geniuses are not allowed to think, if they are not allowed to talk, if they are not allowed to associate, if they are not allowed to invest, if they are not allowed to profit, then all that genius, all that brain power is just going to come to nothing. So you need both people and you need freedom. Now the question is, can superabundance continue? Now in our book, we talk about an infinitely bountiful planet. Infinitely is a big word here. Can it be sustained? Do we really have an infinite planet? Not everybody thinks that. Kenneth Boulding, an American environmentalist, said, anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. But from a wealth-creating perspective, the number of atoms, everything on Earth is created of atoms. Is the number of atoms finite? Well, we'll get to that. But from a wealth-creating perspective, the number of atoms doesn't actually matter very much. This is a Lamborghini Huracan worth $250,000, and this is a Lamborghini Huracan worth $5,000. The number of atoms is exactly the same, but they've been arranged differently. The first one was arranged intelligently, right? The human brain arranged the tires and the engine and the screen and the CD player or whatever else. And the second was arranged chaotically. So the real value comes out of intelligent thought, not out of atoms themselves. That's the point that I'm making. And what's so important is that human intelligence allows us to expand the resource pie. It allows us to grow our resources. And here I'm going to speak for a little while about how it's done. First of all, you can increase the supply of resources. When the price of something goes up, such as, for example, the price of oil, what do smart enterprising people do? They go and search for new oil deposits. Second way you increase supply is by technological change. There are a number of oil rigs that were supposed to be exhausted because you could no longer get oil out of the ground out of traditional methods of drilling. And then an enterprising dude from Texas decided to start fracking, and suddenly all those fields that were uneconomical became very economical, and he became a billionaire. So the point is that through technological breakthroughs, you can suddenly exploit previously uneconomical deposits. That there is increased efficiency. A can of Coke 50 years ago used to weigh 3 ounces of aluminum. Today it weighs only half an ounce. In the 1950s or 1960s, if you wanted to show that you were a strong man, you would crush that can in your hand. That actually took effort because you were crushing 3 ounces of aluminum. Today, even a baby can do it because they are crushing only half an ounce. So relatively, you make more cans of Coke, but you're using less stuff to produce it, less aluminum or less tin. But you can also increase your efficiency absolutely. What do I mean by that? Well, Andrew McAfee from MIT looked at economic growth of the United States and resource use, and they would normally go in parallel. But around 2010, what started happening is that our growth continued to increase, but the total tonnage of resources that we were using in the economy started to go down. In other words, we decoupled economic growth from our use of resources. And what he found, that 66 out of the resources which were tracked by the United States Geological Survey were post-peak. Zinc, iron, whatever else. We are using less and less resources while our economy continues to grow. I'm going to offer you some ideas about how that can happen. We can increase value from a resource. Think about sand. When we first melted sand into glass, we use it as glass beads for self-beautification. Later, people realized that you can turn sand into glasses that you drink out of. Sometime later, we turned glass into, or sand, into windows. Today, we are using sand in fiber optic cables and in microchips. So with every step of the way, the amount of money, the amount of value that you get out of a grain of sand has increased dramatically. So that's another way in which you can increase your resource base. We can turn that which is useless into that which is useful. When in Pennsylvania, people started digging for oil, they started noticing that aside from oil, there was this gas that was coming out of the earth, and if somebody lit a cigarette, then the entire rig would explode, killing a lot of workers. So what we started doing was to flare natural gas. In other words, we would burn it off. And in fact, today, if you go to developing world, which is not terribly technologically sophisticated, you still see a flame on top of an oil rig. That's the natural gas which is being flared off. It's very unusual in the United States because what we do instead, we capture that gas and then we sell it to warm our homes and whatever else, okay? So we turn something that was not just useless but actually harmful into something that is useful. Substitution. Humans actually don't care how we get a certain service, we just care about getting it. If you wanted to read a book 300 years ago, somebody would have to go out to the Atlantic, kill a whale, you would open up its brain, you would scoop up a deposit called spermaceti, you would turn it into a candle, and then you would read your book. Today, we use electricity. Not only is it cheaper, more efficient, but we no longer have to kill those beautiful, I guess they're not fish, they're really, yes, that's right, yeah. In the similar vein, people obsess about electric vehicles. They say, oh my God, they need lithium. What will happen when the lithium supply runs out? How are you going to drive all those electric vehicles? Well, nobody knows what's going to happen in 20 years. Maybe we will no longer need lithium in order to power our electric vehicles. Maybe we'll need sodium. Sodium ion currently is replacing lithium ion as a main component in battery manufacturing, and we have much more sodium than lithium. So substitution is an incredibly important concept in economics. You still want to get somewhere, you want to still get your service or good, but how you do it is irrelevant to you. And if you can do it more cheaply by producing electricity, by burning natural gas, which before was useless and harmful, that's much better than the alternatives. The other one is dematerialization. This is not just a phone, it's also a TV, it's a camera, it's a radio, it's a compass, it's a map. Think about all those items which are on this phone. Think about putting them on the ground here, right in the middle of this room. Can you imagine how many atoms would there be? How many atoms there go into a separate TV and a camera and a radio and a phone and a calculator and whatever else? It's all here. That's what we call dematerialization. 15 years ago, if you walked into an American hotel, there would be a thick copper cable running from the wall that you would have to plug into your computer to get Wi-Fi. Today, all that copper is used somewhere else or not used at all. Instead, we use airwaves. We have completely dematerialized this particular service. It no longer uses any material whatsoever. That's another way in which you can increase your resource base. We can reuse stuff. Yes, we have a lot of, iron and steel, which is trapped in buildings. But if some point steel became so expensive that we would need more of it, we could always tear down those buildings and get to that. We could get to that steel. We use and reuse stuff all the time. When the Americans were building atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project had to borrow 14,000 tons of silver from the American government. Why? Because back then, the only way that we could enrich uranium is by electromagnets that used silver. Later, people figured out they no longer needed silver, they needed something else in order to create those electromagnets, and all that silver was returned back to the American government, right? So we can reuse stuff. Transmutation is something that a lot of very smart people, including Isaac Newton, possibly the greatest scientist who ever lived, spent a lot of time thinking about how do you convert a base metal into a precious metal. People used to travel around the world in search of the sorcerer's stone, which would enable you to do this magic. But actually, transmutation is real. We can do it. We know how to do it. Every fire alarm in every building in America is constituted, has an element in it called americum. Americium is a transmuted material. It doesn't exist in nature. We have created it through nuclear bombardment. In the same way that decades ago, we turned particles of lead into gold. We know how to do this. It's just that it's incredibly expensive. If we were to create an ounce of gold out of lead, it would probably cost us $1 trillion. Well, not a trillion, $1 quadrillion. It would take so much energy to do it. But imagine if at some point in the future, we had a source of energy that was free. Let's say that we could capture all of the energy from the sun. Or even better, imagine if we could create sun on Earth. What is sun? Sun is just a giant fusion reactor. And we already know how to do fusion. It's just that right now it's quite expensive. But if we can do fusion on Earth, we can potentially create energy so cheap that it will allow us to do transmutation. And as a matter of fact, we don't even need lead or anything else to turn to gold. The only thing we need is hydrogen. When the universe was created after the Big Bang, the universe only created hydrogen, which is the lightest of metals. Everything else that exists in the universe, iron, zinc, copper, was created inside of stars, inside these huge, giant fusion reactors, under different pressures, under different temperatures. All the other materials were created, and when those stars exploded, when they went supernova, they seeded the universe with all the elements which we find on Earth. So hypothetically speaking, all you need in order to create anything else is a fusion reactor and hydrogen. And hydrogen is the most common element in the universe, and it's basically a constituent part of all of our oceans. So there is no shortage of it. Now, of course, by the time that we need it, we will be a space mining civilization. We already have, thanks to Elon Musk, we have humanoid robots being made. We have AI. We have spaceships. There's nothing to keep us hundreds of years into the future from sending armies of humanoid robots powered by AI and solar energy into the asteroid belt to mine for water and whatever else we need down on Earth. But that's very far into the future. Now, So really, the only thing that keeps us from doing that, the only thing that we need is more knowledge. And knowledge, unlike atoms, is potentially unlimited. Here is how the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Romer puts it. He says, "We consistently fail to grasp how many ideas remain to be discovered. The difficulty is the same we have with compounding. Possibilities do not add up, they multiply." Now, to illustrate his point, Paul Romer looked at composite materials. Now, the periodic table contains 100 different elements. And a recipe for a compound material that uses 2 elements, such as copper and tin. Is it copper and tin? Yes, copper and tin. May require up to 10,000 different calculations. So you have 100 elements in the periodic table. And if you want a recipe that actually works for a compound material, then you have to calculate 100 times 99, so you get up to 10,000 different calculations. Now, that takes a tremendous amount of time. Or you can rely on luck, which is exactly what our ancestors did when they combined those 2 materials in order to create in order to create bronze, which gave birth to the Bronze Age. So that's just 2 out of the 100. If you wanted to create composite material out of 4 different elements, well, that would require 94 million different calculations. And if you were to combine 10 different elements into making a composite material, that would require more seconds than expired since the beginning of the Big Bang 14 billion years ago. So what this tells you is that there was far too little time and far too human beings to even scratch the possibility of creating new knowledge, the possibility of new combinations, new ways of combining and recombining atoms in order to create wealth. So, in our book, we conclude by saying that the world is finite in the same way that a piano is finite. The piano has only 88 keys, but it can generate an infinite number of songs. And the same is true for our planet. There is only an infinite number of atoms, that is, unless we go and mine the asteroid belt. So there is a finite number of atoms, but how we use it, how we combine it and recombine it, that's up to human beings and our freedom to experiment. So what really matters is not the number of atoms. What matters is the human brain and its freedom to innovate and create more knowledge. Thank you very much.
How about another round of applause for Dr. Marian Tupy? So I don't know about you called this a brilliant audience, and I could not agree more. They're a smart bunch. I don't know about them, but I feel rather hopeful about that and about our future, as perhaps complex as the topic might be. Marian, I want to take us back to the beginning when you knew you had a book, and I do want to mention the book is for sale tonight. The author will sign it. That'll happen out in the lobby. I know it looks thick, but it really is an engaging and great read. When did you know you had a book here?
So we wrote a paper in 2018, basically dealing with the concept, and the proof of concept was there. And then we thought, okay, so we can probably turn it into a book. So it took us about 2 years to write, but I think we always wanted to turn it into a book after we published the first paper. Yeah.
So when you had the idea and you started discussing this with colleagues, what was the initial reaction that this is something so significant we have to talk about it? Or there was skepticism, or you had a reaction that said, explain it to me, tell me more. What were your colleagues saying when you said, you and Gail have an idea here and you're exploring it in this book?
Well, the paper was welcome. The paper was well received, and so as a consequence, we felt that we had a potentially good product here. The key was to get an okay from colleagues smarter than me on the methodology. And in fact, the book has been out for a couple of years, and before then there was the paper, and nobody objected to the way that we were doing it, and in fact, nobody has objected since. So that was the key, really, to get the approval from people who understood the subject. Why was it important to do? That's what you asked, right? I mean, why
Yes.
did we decide to do this? I mean, I think that that's a more involved answer, I think. About 20 years ago, I realized that the environmental movement was beginning to exhibit signs of anti-humanism. I'm an environmentalist, probably most people here are, but we are really conservationists. What we want is to somehow combine life on Earth for humans with that of animals and plants. We somehow want to create a symbiosis where everybody can flourish. How we can do that, we can discuss later. But what I noticed was that the environmental movement was becoming tremendously anti-human. There were, things like you shouldn't have children because of their environmental footprint. Human beings are a cancer on the planet. There is an entire movement called Extinction Rebellion. They want people to go extinct, And also the environmental movement became a depository for all sorts of anti-freedom ideas, such as in order to protect the planet, you have to give up capitalism. In order to and consumption, because capitalism and consumption go hand in hand. In order to protect the climate, you have to give up democracy because people will never vote to limit their standards of living. Therefore, we shouldn't have a vote on that sort of thing. I mean, John Kerry said that only 2 weeks ago, and so I knew that what I wanted to work a little more on the environmental question, and I could have gone in 2 different ways. I could do climate change, or I could do resources, because those are the two main concerns of the environmental movement. And I didn't want to do climate change because I'm not a physicist, and you really need to be super smart and know a lot of things to do climate change. So I just decided to do resources.
I don't think that we're doubtful that you are super smart and you know a lot of things, and I think we're grateful that you stuck in this lane, and it's just so fascinating. Early in the presentation, you talked about the
let me just say something. I mean, to understand climate change properly, you need to be a physicist to understand the clouds. You have to be a physicist and a chemist who understands the ocean. It's an incredibly complex subject, and there really are very few people who understand the whole picture entirely, which is why you should always be skeptical when you see somebody on TV. Beg your pardon? Okay.
Is it just in the headset, Judy, or are others having a problem hearing us?
Okay.
Okay,
Anyway.
so Judy, it might just be the headset. Maybe one of our team members can get Judy a new headset. Thanks for the heads up there, Judy. We appreciate you.
Sorry, that was all. Yeah.
No, so I no doubt a lot of armchair climate change scientists out there. In talking about using right terminology and advancing conversations, you had mentioned early in the presentation that even journalists are guilty when we're talking about prices. And thinking about nominal prices or real prices, but using time prices. How do we further advance the conversation to think about this the right way? Another way to say, how do we get more attention paid to how you're looking at this as opposed to how it might be misrepresented in mainstream media when it comes to prices, inflation, real, nominal, but not time?
Well, in part of our work, I mean, I'm very pleased to say that over the last 2 years, we have seen a lot more work being done with time prices. Because I think that people intuitively, once they understand it, they realize this is the real way to do it. Because the only commodity which is really scarce is time, right? I mean, we only get so many years on this earth. So the less time we have to spend earning enough money to buy food or car or paying off the house, the more time we have to do other things which please us. So people are starting to work on time prices. Now, how do you do it? I mean, I think that the first thing that you need to do is to have this in your mind when you read a typical news story. It's extraordinary to me how few journalists understand even the difference between a nominal and a real price, let alone a time price. And so whenever you read a newspaper, ask yourself, what kind of scaremongering job is the journalist doing here? Is this really true? And then you can do these exercises by yourself, finding out how much things cost by really just looking at your own paycheck and figuring it out.
So I appreciate that on one of your slides on the list we end with space mining. So no doubt, I think we're thinking well into the future of things that we can't even really conceptualize right now. But when you were running these numbers, did you find that there is a cap to human population on the Earth? Do we run out at 16 billion? 32 billion? When do we, for those that might be in an airplane flying over some country and say there's plenty of space, do you know that number?
Oh boy, there are papers that argue that the world could be a home to 100 billion people, even 1 trillion people. Remember that Earth is not two-dimensional; it's three-dimensional. You can always go vertical. I mean, I was driving here from Buffalo to Erie. I mean, the country is empty. I mean, seriously, do you know how many mile-high skyscrapers you could put just between Buffalo and Erie? I mean, if everybody had, what is it? Musk just said if there are 8 billion people in the world, if if everybody was as crowded, and I'm not suggesting we should go in that direction, ma'am, don't worry. If everybody was as crowded as a typical commuter train, you could put 8 billion people in Manhattan. If you wanted to give every human being on Earth an acre of land, you could put 8 billion people in Texas. The state of Texas could have 8 billion people in it, everybody with an acre of land. The world is empty. The population density in Hong Kong is 360 per square mile, or is it a square mile, something like that. It's very high, but it's not an unpleasant place to live. In fact, you see our problem in America is not that we are overcrowded. The problem is that people are leaving communities in rural areas where the population density is small, and they are willingly and eagerly moving to areas where population density is much higher. So is there an upper limit? Well, not really, in a sense that if we had enough knowledge to build an infinite skyscraper, you could put infinite number of people in it. That's just a question of physics and knowledge of how you handle it.
Well, I think that's what's so fascinating about this
Also, one more thing. Sorry, I keep, but the things that come to my mind, and then I have to.
No,
interrupt
this
you.
is
Sorry.
great. This is your show. I'm just wallpaper.
Singapore is now 21% bigger than it was when it became independent in 1961. Land reclamation. So even if at some point it became, that I don't know, we somehow ran out of land because we can no longer put everybody in Texas, you could still actually create more land by reclamation. 1/3 of Holland is underwater, essentially, land which is reclaimed from nature. So there are other ways. It's not true that we have a finite amount of land. You can build more land.
And I appreciate that answer, because I think people might be thinking like there has to be an end to this, but I think that such an important part of this is intelligence and human capacity to create, and to create something that we can't recognize yet, like an infinite skyscraper. Great questions from the audience. Keep them coming. I'm going to work through as many as I can in some of mine. So if you have yours written, just raise your index card. One of our team members will come get that and bring it to me. You talked about the abundance of hydrogen in the ocean, and this comes from somebody. Are we worried, though, because the oceans are finite like the rest of the planet? When it comes to water, and we're a water-based planet, this person's concerned about where water figures into the superabundance concept. We need water. Are you worried about that at all? Is that a concern that you ran into in the book?
Well, not really, because water is not going anywhere. The same amount of water which was there at the time of the Cro-Magnon or the Anthropocene is still here. It's just changes. Sometimes it's fresh water, sometimes it's salt water, sometimes it's dirty water, sometimes it's clean water. And the way you turn salt water into fresh water is through desalination. We've known how to do that for hundreds of years. And it's dirt cheap, because if you can power a desalination plant with solar panels, then basically you have infinite amount of fresh water, close to infinite amount of fresh water. You just take some from the ocean, you desalinate it, and you're using free electricity from the sun. Israel now recycles 98% of its water, and it's producing. By the way, Israel doesn't have any fresh water, but it's desalinating, and it's producing so much water so cheaply that it's actually providing water to the surrounding Arab countries. So water is not an issue, because we know how to desalinate, and 71% of Earth's surface is covered by water. Where is that water going to go? It's just going to go back into the oceans, and we'll desalinate it again, and it's just going to go on like that forever.
This person's wondering whether or not this can be gamed out, or maybe it's possible in different economies. We talked about free markets and the importance of that and capitalism. Is that essential to this argument, or could this happen in other economies?
I think that capitalism is a far better system when it comes to saving resources, because if you don't have resources properly priced, you end up you used to in the Soviet Union. Soviet Union used to use a lot of energy for heating, for example. It was so cheap that in the middle of winter people would leave their windows open because it didn't matter. Heating was so free. So there has to be a price mechanism which tells you, what's more expensive, what's less expensive. There is no problem with water in California. The problem is that it's not properly priced, and so it makes sense for a Californian grower of almonds to spend 8 gallons of water to produce 1 almond. That's not a problem of not having enough water. It's a problem of water being completely mispriced.
So this person is saying if population growth is the key to this, and notably you started the presentation with the population growth numbers of native-born people in their countries, shouldn't this be an argument then for immigration? Let more people come here, grow your countries with immigration we should attract.
Well, yes. I mean, if Americans refuse to have babies and Americans still want to receive Social Security or Medicare, and if we want to have more economic growth in the country, then we need immigrants and their babies. I happen to think that if we can have an immigration system that people trust, meaning that people come here legally, and we can ensure that they are not criminal, and that they can sustain themselves, then I think immigration is to our benefit. We are a very lucky country in a sense that people still want to come here. China is in terrible demographic trouble and nobody wants to live there. Same in Russia. These countries are dying and nobody wants to live there. Everybody wants to live here, and we are very fortunate that we can choose the best if you want to.
What about
Can you imagine how much it would cost to rent a room in a hotel in America if it wasn't for the cheap foreign labor?
I think it shows the benefit, especially as jobs shift and who is doing what, and how we're supplementing that economy and figuring out ways to incorporate more people in it. If in fact we're not having native births or our birth rate is slowing. So what about human waste? Now, we're not talking about the byproduct of our bodies, but actual garbage here. This person's wondering about that. We keep producing waste. Where does all that go? Won't that fill up the planet? What do we do in terms of more people producing more byproduct and waste? How does that factor into the superabundance? Do we just keep building bigger trash mountains, or is that just not a factor we're thinking about?
We've always been a circular economy in a sense that waste has always been reused for something else. Natural gas, after all, was waste, and we are using it for something else. Plastic gets reused, a lot of it. We are now working, for example, I know that plastic is something that concerns a lot of people. We are working in order to degrade it biologically, for example. We now have bacteria that can live at room temperature that actually feed off plastic, so maybe we can degrade some of it. We can, of course, burn a lot of it. I mean, we could burn all of it. Our problem is that, first of all, it's not that much of a big deal. If you think about 8 billion people being able to live in Texas, we really are only scratching the surface of the planet in terms of, there are places to put rubbish into for thousands of years. But if we did run out of space for some reason, we could always incinerate it. Our problem is that we don't want to incinerate it because that produces more emissions, right? Now, if you could figure out a way of incinerating without any environmental damage, then you can incinerate anything forever. And again, in a circular economy. And again, that's just a question of having more knowledge to figure out how to incinerate stuff without emissions. And that should be within the ability of human brain to solve. I mean, we solved other problems.
And speaking of the human brain, this person's talking about any risks to losing our creativity, especially with artificial intelligence. And maybe they attended the program that we just had on artificial intelligence, and we were talking about that and how do we keep pace with that which we are designing to make our lives easier and to advance our technologies. But do we lose some of our creativity when we're substituting artificial intelligence? This person's wondering about that. Do we lose our mind share if something else is doing all the work for us?
Well, not necessarily. the geniuses, the innovators will still innovate regardless of what the AI does. In the short to medium term, AI is just going to be a helper to us. It's going to enhance our productivity. In the long run, yes, it's possible that AI could do everything we do, but that doesn't mean that we cannot. I mean, the promise of AI is for a planet where the population is collapsing and people really refuse to have babies, and consequently, in order to bring about new ideas, you have to use AI because people are no longer doing that. Our problem is different. Our problem is that we don't have enough people coming up with new ideas, not that AI is taking over those ideas. AI right now cannot actually create new innovations. It cannot come up with its new ideas. And we don't know if it ever will. The concept is called artificial general. What is it? AGI.
Generative AI.
Artificial general intelligence. Basically, the idea is that AI should be able to come up with its own ideas, and that's certainly not happening right now. We don't know if it will ever happen, and there will always be scope for human ingenuity, even if you do have AI.
What this person's curious.
You will still, forgive me, you will still be able to paint or compose poems or plant tomatoes in your garden, even if AI is producing, your car or whatever else.
Or you could design 10-mile-high skyscrapers and find other ways to innovate. This person's curious about.
By the way, I don't know what people are so afraid. I mean, we do already have a lot of people who are not working, who are not innovating, and are having a good time, and we call them retirees. I mean,
and we do really like them. We're glad that some of them are here tonight. Just a few. This is a youthful crowd.
So it's not like the world is ending because people don't break their bum in the office every day. I mean, seems to me like many of these people are probably having a good time.
There are
maybe not here right now, but
no, I think we're having a good time. Even though I do have a lot of concerns here. I think people are concerned about it, that there will be this tipping point, or we're going to lose the margin on climate change, or we are going to deplete our resources. Somehow it's going to break. And no doubt you've encountered the skeptics along the way that say there has to be at some point this is going to give. How do you comfort those people that have real concerns about it? I hear you, but I'm having a hard time fully buying into this concept.
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to contend with ideas which are really non-explanatory, which are just a feeling of doom and gloom. I mean, if people feel doom and gloom, they wouldn't be the first ones to do that. I think that we have evolved to feel doom and gloom. I mean, I think that optimists, probably got eaten by lions, and pessimists survived because they ran away. And
there's a reason the hair stands up still on the back of our necks when something's in the room.
That's right. Like cats, why the hair start.
They look bigger.
They look bigger, precisely. Yeah, and so. Yes, doom and gloom is, we have evolved for that, and it's probably a good thing that we have. That's how we survived, and that's how we flourished. But just because people have a feeling of doom and gloom, that's not enough to go on. You have to give me an example of how you think the world is going to end. If it's going to end because we are going to run out of space, then my answer is an infinite skyscraper. My God, different planets. I mean, pick your vision of humanity in 10,000 years, a multiplanetary species mining the asteroid belt for whatever we don't have on Earth. It's just infinite number of possibilities.
And look how far we came from the 70s to 2022 and thinking about Soylent Green, and we'd be here by now. Totally different world than what we were imagining all those decades ago.
I think that what people usually mean when they say doom and gloom, they think that we are going to destroy animals and plants because we are going to just there are going to be more of us, and we are going to build and I think this is what certainly before I started studying, this is how I was thinking about it. You've got more roads, you've got more airports, and animals, the area shrink, and ultimately we don't have nature anymore. But actually the opposite is happening, thanks to capitalism. First thing that you need to bear in mind is that we are undergoing a unprecedented rate of urbanization. People are leaving the countryside and moving into the cities. By 2100, 80% of all human beings will be living in cities. That means that the biggest disruptor to nature is going to withdraw from nature, is going to bugger off into a city, and nature is going to rebound. Just go away from your house for 2 or 3 years and come back and see what nature has done to your house, right? So nature is going to rebound, and the key is to get off the land. We are doing that. We no longer live on land. In fact, that some people consider that a problem in the United States. The second thing which we can do is, of course, to become tremendously agriculturally productive. What do I mean by that? 100 years ago, you maybe produced 1 ton of wheat per acre of land. Now you produce 4, right? So you're moving from, 20 bushels to 400 bushels, or no, from 40 bushels to 120 bushels, whatever, per acre of land. So what you want to do is to produce as much food on as little land as possible, and then feed the people in the city. And then the rest of the world can be returned back to animals. So on one calculation, if every farmer in the world was as productive as an American farmers are extremely productive, but the rest of the world isn't. If every farmer in the world became as productive as American farmer is today, we could return the land mass the size of India back to nature, because we wouldn't need it.
And I think that's important in that same conversation, is realizing that the argument that cities are more environmentally friendly than smaller towns because of the amount of energy it takes
Absolutely.
to pipe utilities out into rural areas, the amount of energy that it takes to create things, unless of course you're living on renewables, right? If you are using solar or wind power or something else. So I think an important conversation of where people are going and how they're resorting in terms of the resources, in terms of the land, in terms of the amount of energy deployed to live in a place.
That's part of it. And also, so imagine that you have solar and also, or maybe fusion, and it's extremely cheap. What you can do is to, of course, grow stuff underground. So let's imagine New York City in 200 years' time. All the transport is in the sky because we now have, what do you call them? Flying cars. And you can turn the subway into a giant farm, which is powered by LED lights. And, you grow your lettuce and your tomatoes basically underneath the New York City. I mean, it's just a question of having enough energy to do it. You don't even need earth. We now, hydroponics and aeroponics are taking off, and they don't actually need anything. They just need water and sunlight. So there is a way to do this, provided you have cheap enough energy and enough knowledge.
So this question comes from a younger person in the audience, and I know that because they've written it's from a younger person, and they're thinking quality of life, because for as much as the more population we have, the more likely we are to have geniuses, super geniuses that are going to create those innovative leaps and bring innovation. But what about those that struggle in terms of jobs, opportunities, education, things that people are struggling with today? If there are more people, is there more struggle? How does superabundance help quality of life?
Well, welcome to the real world, young person. I mean, everybody has always struggled in life. Everybody here has struggled in order to have a career, buy a house, save for retirement, bring up the children, send them to university. Struggle is a part of life. Now, maybe in the future, if people listen to me and read my book, there will be superabundance and you will no longer have to struggle. For now, you still have to struggle in order to get good things in life. I mean, that's just reality. And no, it's not true that if you have more people in the world, you will have more competition for jobs necessarily, because we all create more than we consume. We create opportunities. So, for example, in 1900, 40% of all Americans, 40% of Americans were involved on a farm in some form of creating food. Today, it's 1%. Now, we don't have 39% unemployment. All those people started working other things, such as the hotel industry, the travel industry, and whatever else. In the 1970s, people used to write their letters on a typewriter, and every executive would have a secretary with a typewriter, and so all those typewriters are gone. Everybody's doing their own typewriting on their computer. A lot of people used to drive buggies around and horses, in order to move people around. Now we have cabs, or we drive our own car. Things change, but we do have 8 billion people in the world, and we still have 4% unemployment. That means that jobs have changed, but massive unemployment hasn't occurred, even though there was tremendous amount of technological change. People used to worry in the 1990s that with IT, there would be mass unemployment. But all that happened with IT is that now you needed an IT department to show you how the bloody photocopier works, So...
It's the jobs of the future that I think we have sometimes a challenge anticipating because they're in the future.
Well, that has happened a number of times in human past. I mean, Industrial Revolution destroyed the agricultural world. The IT revolution destroyed the pre-IT world. We are now going through changes. Well, of course, by definition, we don't know what the future is going to look like and what the jobs of the future are going to look like. If we knew what they looked like, then wouldn't be here. We would be probably, multi-billionaires or whatever else.
Okay, here's to being multi-billionaires tomorrow. But 2 final questions for tonight. One person is asking, what surprised you the most when you were researching for the book? Maybe you had a eureka moment. Maybe it wasn't a eureka moment, but something that just really did surprise you that you didn't anticipate. What did you find when you were researching for the book?
The constant rate of growth was higher than population. I mean, we thought we would find stuff that was sort of just about increasing in abundance, but literally all of our data sets point to superabundance, not increasing abundance, but superabundance. We just keep on creating more than we consume. Every human being on average creates more than they, and the data shows that. I mean, it's not like, we cherry picked, we just put it into a computer program and it spat out at us, everything is increasing at a superabundant rate. So that was unexpected. And what we also found was that the rate of change was actually increasing. In other words, the rate of increase in abundance was increasing over the decades. So far from living in a world of declining innovation and stagnation, we are actually seeing accelerating rate of change.
So I think that is an excellent segue to the last question, which I'm going to ask you, but I'm going to ask you to think on it for a second, because then I'll say a few things to these folks here in the room. This person's wondering, what are the greatest threats? If you're surprised by that data set, all 18 of them are in superabundance. It looks like this is the future. This is the way. What sort of threats? What challenges the superabundant path forward? What are you most concerned about? What keeps you up at night? But before you answer that, I do want to thank all of you for coming out tonight and spending time with us here, being with us for this event. We are away for a few days, but we return with programming on the campus of Gannon University in the Yale room Monday night for that panel that Dr. Furky Ferrati, the president of the JES, told you about earlier. Tickets still available for that. The following night, we are back here for Harold Holzer, a famed Lincoln historian who will talk about Lincoln in the anti-civil immigration or anti-civil immigration in Lincoln's era and today. And then we have the media panel to make sense of something that you actually talked about at the top of your presentation. It turns out there was an election, and there's a lot to think about. We'll have the experts in the room to talk about it that night. Thank you for holding all your political questions. We appreciate that tonight. And then we conclude things with Dr. Eddie Galad Jr. Back at the campus of Gannon University. Tickets still available, jeserie.org. And of course, a huge thanks to our team here for making all the programming possible, our board of trustees, and of course our sponsors, including tonight's, the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority in ECRA. Marian, back to that question. What keeps you up at night? What are the greatest threats to superabundance, impediments, things that would knock it off course? What worries you?
Well, I think it's very important to understand that there is some sort of a determinist or a force in the universe that guides us toward superabundance, toward prosperity. We can mess it up. Nothing is predetermined. From the perspective of superabundance, of course, part of it is population depopulation. When you have, in the absence of AGI, if you have a population of the world declining, then you are going to have basically fewer people coming up with innovations, which means that economic growth is going to either slow or plateau. Second thing is that there is a problem with freedom of speech. In order to think freely, you need to have access to all of the world's knowledge. If some people are prevented from speaking because maybe they were cancelled for saying something in the past, you cannot incorporate their thoughts into your own thinking process, and consequently you cannot think freely. And also a lot of extremely important people in the world when it comes to innovation and moving humanity forward are actually a little bit nuts. When you think about somebody like Elon, right? He's absolutely brilliant, but he's also out there, right? So the question is, for example, what would happen if Elon got cancelled because of some of the things he said? Would we had a giant 25-story rocket being caught with chopsticks? Probably not. And so these are the trade-offs. And then, of course, the freedom of the market. It's very important to understand that people come up with trillions of ideas per day. Most of them are horrible. So it has to be the market which decides whether it should be the iPhone or whether it should be the BlackBerry, whether it should be the VHS or Betamax, whether you should be driving a Tesla or you should be driving a Trabant. The market has to make these decisions, the freedom of the market. Once the government starts deciding we are going to support that industry. Remember 10, 15 years ago when our government in its infinite wisdom decided that the future of light bulbs were those funny little ones that look like an ice cream cone? Well, those were rubbish, right? And we no longer use them because the free market gave us LED lights, right? So you don't want the government to tell you that you should be buying X and Y and we should be subsidizing that industry as opposed to that industry. And that's what freedom of the market is about. The freedom says, I'm going to leave it up to you, consumers, to choose whatever you want to use. And if the market destroys capitalism, it destroys the signal that you as a consumer, by buying and selling or refusing to buy, send in terms of what we need more of and what we need less of. So those are the sorts of things. And on a more macro level, of course, we could still screw it up by, for example, nuclear conflict. I think that nuclear weapons are a much more serious threat to humanity than climate change and will remain so probably forever.
So on that optimistic note, but good ideas win the day. Great books are available for sale tonight. Marian Tupy, the author of Superabundance. Thank you for joining us for the Global Summit tonight. Folks, thanks for coming out. We'll see you back next week. Good night.